Todd, great to see you again, coming to us from Hawaii, correct?
You are correct, sir. Yes. The island of Kauai, more precisely.
Nice. Well, it's a nice place to be hanging out.
It's great. If you got to be stranded somewhere, this is probably
The
the
place to
place.
be.
Yeah.
Nice, nice. So we're happy to have you join us here at GearFest Online here in 2020. Great we were able to make this connection. We appreciate you taking the time to sit down with us today.
Well, it's a lot easier than going to Indiana around now. So
Right,
get used to it.
a little shorter trip anyway, right? Just plug in and you're here. So I wanted to talk to you about a number of different things today. Obviously, you've had such a long career, and we did a fairly lengthy interview last time you were here at Sweetwater, actually. But I'm kind of curious to talk to you about a couple different aspects of the things that you do. And one of those is the fact that you're always, at least looking at it from the outside looking in, it looks like you're always on the leading edge of the current technology. I mean, everything from being a pioneer with home studios to a pioneer with home video studios to a mutual friend of ours was telling me about how you pioneered the use of in-ear monitors using a pirate FM radio station and some of the different technologies you've worked in. Talk a little bit about that. What draws you to new technology and what keeps you excited about it?
I grew up in a household that was more or less steeped in technology because my dad was an engineer. He worked at a DuPont plant, and he was something of a polyglot himself, but he knew how to do electronic circuitry. He knew mechanics, drafting, had a big craftsman set up in the basement and stuff like that. So the technology was kind of taken for granted in our household. And I always had an interest in it for various reasons, some of them musical, some of them not. I got interested in computers very early on when I was just maybe before I was in my teens. I was just fascinated with the idea of a computer being able to think. So when personal computers became available, I just started collecting them. You know, I had an Altair, one of the very first ones that came out. It was a kit. You had to put it together yourself, and the programming involved first toggling in the boot thing with little switches, and that would enable it to read the paper tape reader on the teletype that you use for the I/O device.
Right,
So
right.
I was an early adopter, especially in terms of computers, but I don't necessarily adopt everything.
Mm-hmm.
I don't own a cell phone. Well,
Okay.
actually, I do own a cell phone. I bought an iPhone 11, but just for the camera.
Okay.
So it has no, I don't have a SIM card in it.
Oh, wow.
I just use it for a photographic device. And it took me a long time to get into digital recording at first. Not because I had some attitude about the technology. It was just damn expensive at first,
Right.
you know, and I've always gone for like the most accessible thing. Because my priorities are always that the music is the most important thing, and you don't put impediments in terms of capturing the music or presenting the music. So, you know, oftentimes the studio experience is, you know, it prevents people from getting into the whole experience of making music because of how expensive it is, because the time is also at a premium because other people want to use the studio besides you.
Right.
So that's when I got into, you know, building my own studio back in 1972 or something like that, built my first studio. And it was just what I could afford. I wasn't going for like the top of the line, everything technological. As a matter of fact, there was a lot of home equipment in there.
Right.
You know, there was Dolby made home versions of their noise reduction for people who had reel-to-reel tape machines. And so those were cheaper, and that's what we used.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't really do the things that were a normal part of the routine in a studio, like constantly calibrating the machines and that sort of thing. We were just really guerrilla about it. And that's always been my philosophy in terms of what technologies I adapt. If they seamlessly fit into what I'm doing, then I then I'll seek to learn about it and adopt it. But if it looks like it's an impediment of some kind, or the learning curve is too long, or the technology is really new and expensive, I don't have to have it. I just have to be comfortable when I'm working.
Right, right. Well, that's kind of an interesting kind of a thing that you're talking about there, because it's very easy to get lost in the technology and to spend all your time learning the technology or working with the technology as opposed to actually creating. And you mentioned that you have certain criteria there, but how do you draw that line? How do you keep your focus on the creative side of it?
Well, a lot of it for me goes on inside my head. So it doesn't involve hardly any technology at all, except the wetware.
Right.
And while I do have all of the tools that I could possibly want, tools that I will never get to use in some instances, just because of how much there is and how easy it is to acquire. I tend actually, when I'm working, to focus on a couple of favorite things, and not really, as you say, I find myself, an hour and a half later, having gone through every possible preset sound for one synthesizer,
right.
Looking for that sound. And I suddenly realize, just put anything on there for now, and maybe you'll stumble on the right thing later, or address that question later. But you can really go down a rabbit hole sometimes and forget what it is you're actually trying to do.
Conversely, the technology can also sometimes drive things. And I'm curious if this works that way for you. You did, for example, the album where you had the Fairlight and you did sampling, a cappella album. You've done quite a bit of stuff with the video toaster early on. You were an early adopter of those things. Did finding those products drive projects, or were you looking for a solution and those products filled it?
Well, sometimes, as in the case of the video toaster, it's something that you have been looking for in a way. I got into computer graphics fairly early on because of my interest in computers and because I had a video studio. And I later had a computer studio as well, in partnership with NewTek, who made the video toaster. And I remember I was at a SIGGRAPH convention, and I really hadn't had it in my head that I was looking for any particular kind of video or computer technology, because it still was, the good stuff was expensive. Mm-hmm. The SGI machines were, compared to an Apple computer, orders of magnitude more expensive. But then I was walking by this booth and I saw the demo going on with not only the video capabilities of the toaster, but also had Lightwave, one of the seminal 3D authoring environments. And that really interested me. So, and it just happened to be that one of the guys in the booth was Dana Carvey's brother, Brad Carvey, who worked for NewTek and recognized me, and I suddenly had an in. So first thing I did was buy 3 of them, started on the project, did the math, and realized I was never going to get it finished in any reasonable amount of time. So I sent a little sample of what I had to NewTek, and they said, okay, we're sending you 30 machines.
Wow.
And that was when there was no networking,
Right.
Like, I was sneaker netting drives around between the different machines, filling them up, dumping them off to a video disk drive, and then refilling them. So I was willing to do things that probably look fairly silly to a professional house. But when you're motivated, you learn how to do these things. You figure out your solutions. Mm-hmm. Even if it was ad hoc and, won't last beyond the project you're working on.
Right, right. That reminds me of a quote that you had on your website that I actually had noted down here that I was going to ask you about. And there are 2 quotes, actually. One is, the computer is a way to take something that's assumed and deconstruct your previous assumptions. What does that mean to you?
Well, computer programming is a problem-solving exercise, and you have a larger problem, like the functionality that you want to offer in your application. And then you find that it breaks down into lots and lots and lots of littler problems, down to little tiny problems, like exactly what color this button should be when you touch it, or how do you make it so that the user can't enter wrong data into the system and crash it, and things like that. So, you think that you're working on something that's mostly about the functionality, about the final product. But then when you get into issues of user experience and interface and haptics and all that other stuff, you realize that it's a lot more complicated and detailed. And as they say in the computer business, you spend 99% of your time getting the product almost there. And then you spend another 99% of your time actually getting it to market.
Right.
In other words, once you've got it to the place where you think it works, and then you send it out for beta testing or something like that, then you discover this whole other raft of things that are wrong with it that you have to address. It's a lifestyle, put it that way. It's more than just like a skill that you have. It possesses your brain. I've been doing a lot of programming lately because we're thinking of reintroducing Patronet. And I'm learning JavaScript, which I never really got serious about before. Mm-hmm. And it's one of those things where like it's in my sleep now. Right. It's edging music out of my brain, which is very dangerous because I'm not making money off of the computer programming yet.
Right. Right. But that all ties back to you've been very interested in multimedia and interactive type things, in particular, going back to interactive CDs, correct? And working forward from there. How does all that factor back into that?
It was an interesting time when we were doing those interactive products because we didn't realize how transitional it was. The internet wasn't a thing yet. You know, this was like the late 80s, something like that. And we were just trying to figure out ways to expand the experience beyond just listening to the music. And so there are all different approaches about how to embed additional data onto a conventional CD. There was the short-lived CDI format, and for a while it was the Philips, I think, was called CDI, but I'm not sure. And then there was the mixed media ones. Those were a real hassle because you had to make them work on Apples and PCs, and Microsoft was always blowing things up, just like they do nowadays. And then we discovered in the long run, you know, that you go to all this trouble, you know, and you debug and stuff like that, and you get it, you know, 95%. Some people will always have trouble with it. But then you discover, you know, how much hassle it is to go through the manufacturing process and then the returns process of the hard stuff. Then here along comes the internet, and you realize you can update things all the time. You know, you got a fix you need to make, you make it on the server, and then everyone has the benefit on their client. So the whole idea of these fixed media formats kind of started to dissolve as soon as the internet came online, and as soon as something like Napster, or even before that, the internet music, can't remember it, IA something. It's got an acronym that I've forgotten, but it was even a forerunner to Napster. And when they proved that music and other sorts of media could be delivered remotely, well, it freaked the record companies out, of course, sure. But it also opened up all of these doors that have essentially founded the world that we live in now, in which anyone can be a musician, anyone can record the ideas that they have, and anyone can distribute them.
Right, right. It seems like you went from you mentioned fixed media, but the kind of fixed presentation of things as a producer of albums, and this is the music and you consume it, to where your interest seems to have grown into more the interactive side of it, even with the things you're doing now with interactive virtual streaming on the internet and those kinds of things. What is the draw of that interactive side of being an artist?
You expect a reaction to what you do. And not only that, you know, the audience's attitudes have changed over time. Music had a lot to do with it, but eventually all forms of entertainment have succumbed to it. Back in the day, you had to go home when you got like a new Beatles album or something like that. You went home, you locked the door, you unplugged the phone, and you sat down in the sweet spot and you listened to the whole thing all the way through, maybe 2 or 3 times even. And as soon as the Sony Walkman became a thing, you know, a product, that precious personal listening time suddenly became ubiquitous. You know, it was no longer just you in your house in the sweet spot. You were carrying the music with you everywhere you went. You were making it the background to other activities. So in one sense, you're devaluing the experience, you know, that first listening experience. But also you're making the music conform to you. The end result of that is the audience expects it. They expect to be able to put their hands in it and manipulate it in some way. Like it goes from, you know, the phenomenon of just making mixtapes, you know, taking songs off of different albums that you like and forming them into a new sort of performance. So it isn't necessarily a question of me making a choice about it. Mm-hmm. The audience has already made the choice. And that's a thing that, you know, for instance, the record industry never realized. The audience had already made the choice. You can't change their minds. You can't turn back the clock. Mm-hmm. They're not going to start thinking about music the way that you remember thinking about music. We've got these devices. They're not going away. We've got the internet. We've got cell data. You can have what you want wherever you are. And we just have to resign ourselves to that.
So what does that mean to you as a songwriter and as a producer and as someone who creates music? Do you approach making the music differently?
Well, as time goes on, certainly the process has changed. It's gotten down now where I can make music on my iPad if I have to, but I prefer to do it on my iPad, my MacBook. That's my MacBook Pro, by the way. But I used to need, you know, in the old days when I was running a, you know, relatively primitive Pro Tools session, I needed the biggest, most expensive desktop Macintosh made because I had to have a card cage in it so I could put the cards in it.
Right. And
then I had to buy the additional interface hardware and stuff like that. All of this seems so ridiculously primitive now. And this was only within the last 20 years. I have more power in this laptop than I ever had in any Pro Tools system that I ever, you know, paid through the nose for. I think the very first one I bought cost me $25,000.
And so if I understand correctly, you're working mostly in Reason now, is that right?
Reason is my go-to, yes. I've been happy with it ever since. As a matter of fact, I kind of integrated Reason into my workflow when I was still using Pro Tools because I had Rewire and I would run all of my synthesizers with Reason because Reason didn't have audio recording capabilities back then.
Right.
And then Reason became two programs, Record and Reason. And then they reintegrated back into Reason. And now they call it something else now. It's Suite.
Right.
It's Reason Suite.
Right.
And so I've got the Suite. I've got pretty much everything I could desire in there. I've rekindled my relationship with Eventide, and I have all their plugins. It's just like 1970s again for me, you know. So I'm, you know, terrifically happy with my work environment, and I'm happy about the whole concept because it means that there are fewer and fewer obstructions to somebody who has real musical talent and ideas from getting that stuff recorded and into people's ears.
Are there things in we'll say the real world that are essential to what you do for creating music or as a musician? Are there guitars? Are there hardware processors, specific microphones you have to have?
Solitude is what I have to have. I need uninterrupted solitude or else my brain doesn't, you know, the noise level doesn't go down far enough for me to hear what I'm actually thinking. Mm-hmm. So when I get into a serious songwriting mode, then I pretty much isolate myself. And I don't do anything. I'm not in a hurry to get down and bang on the keyboard or anything like that. I'm waiting for my subconscious to sort of take over because it usually does a better job of songwriting than my conscious mind.
Mm-hmm. So does it start with a lyric idea? Does it start with a chord progression, with a melody? And how do you take it out of your subconscious and get it out?
It could start with anything. Often I'll have like a lyrical idea pop into my head and I'll jot that down, but I won't necessarily feel impelled to go finish it or turn it into a song right away. Mm-hmm. I tend to catalog a lot of things, and like I say, cram them into my brain, but not feel the obligation to finish right away, because I want my subconscious to do its work.
Mm-hmm.
It does a better job of sort of sorting out what I really think, because your conscious mind has an impression of yourself that you're constantly trying to reinforce. Your subconscious mind has no such impression. It's really you.
Right, right. So at what point then, given that you have such a long history and such a successful history as a producer, does the producer side of your brain kick into that song production process?
Well, I'm doing a lot of collaborations, and that kind of has given me the opportunity to use that production side more, because often, I'll get a demo from someone and the song is pretty much done, but it has to be turned into, a completed record, a completed recording of some kind. So that's kind of where I get the most opportunity to use those production chops, because I don't get a lot of offers for, for records anymore, for doing a whole album for an artist, because the industry has changed. Right. Particularly, the more commercial aspects. You'll look at the credits on a record and there'll be 3 producers and 5 songwriters. And so the whole thing where like you're the Svengali who shepherds somebody through the whole process, that's a much more rare thing nowadays. Very few artists really are looking for that kind of production. They're looking for success. Mm-hmm. And also people don't think in terms of albums as much anymore. They think in the very old fashioned sense, you put out songs and then when you got enough of them, you put them together into an album.
I'm curious about the process, given that and the way that you're working with so many more collaborations, and given the gestation period inside your subconscious, if you will. How does all that work when you have a collaborator? Do you take ideas to them? Do they bring things to you? Or what is the process like?
It works both ways. On the last album, I started out writing stuff thinking, I'll get somebody to participate in each thing that I write. But as it turned out, as a practical matter, that the songs, you can't find somebody to pair up with the song, so I would just finish them off myself. The latest collection of them, I get sometimes something that sounds ostensibly like it's all done, but it turns out to be somebody's MP3 demo and they can't find the tracks anymore for it, and so they have to sort of rebuild it. It has to be rebuilt again in some ways. So I find myself doing that often, deconstructing and rebuilding. I find myself using sometimes AI tools to extract instruments and voices out of a mix when you don't have access to the multi-tracks. Mm-hmm. So it's a different and more sophisticated range of techniques and technologies available. But the goal is still the same for me, is not to make people remark about the sound. It's to get them enthralled with the music, and sometimes, if you're doing a drum and bass thing, it's all about the variety of sounds and the weirdness of the sounds and the evocativeness of them, less than the meaning of the lyrics, because there are none. But
right.
But for me, the goal ultimately is to get, is to elicit that sort of feeling from someone, or that that kind of thing where something about the sound grabs their attention and holds it. Mm-hmm. It's not simply a question of getting above the noise level of everything else, which often is the goal of pop music nowadays, is just differentiate yourself somehow,
Right.
Do Old Town Road, pretend you're a cowboy, something like that. But in the end, I think the reason why I maintain my audience is that particular attention to the experience of listening to a song and trying to make everything that goes into the production an enhancement to that experience, rather than something that's there gratuitously, or that in some ways calls attention away from it.
Mm-hmm. Do you approach that and the way that you collaborate on those type of projects, then do you approach that from a producer mindset, or are you coming in more from a songwriter mindset?
It's hard to separate them. Um, I've never seen the form, like a formal distinction between the two, except in terms of, job description. You're hired to do this. But often, particularly early on in my production career, if it turned out that we were running out of material in the course of a project, or that, a song needed a bridge and the artist was just stumped and couldn't figure out how to do it, then I would just step in and write it. And so that, to me, it's part of my philosophy as a producer overall, which is there's not one thing you're trying to do. What you're trying to do is make up any differences between what the artist brings to the process and what the process requires. So often the material's great and they perform it great. You just have to make it sound great.
Right.
And make, any little fine tuning adjustments that, the sort of detailing that makes the difference between a family car and a luxury automobile.
Right.
They both drive and have wheels and motor and everything like that. And when they're new, they both look great, but one of them is going to last longer.
Mm-hmm.
So I may find myself at some points playing an instrument. I may find myself singing backgrounds. Might find myself writing. In that sense, I don't see it's a continuum of kind of things that you apply. When I'm doing my own records, all of those things get applied.
Right, right. That reminds me of another quote from you, which you said that, where you said that as a producer, you don't really think of a group's music potential. You think of their record potential or their recording potential. What's the difference there?
Well, I guess as an example, I was offered the production on the Tubes' very first record. And I produced 2 records for the Tubes since then. But it was their very first record. And I knew, and they sent me videotapes mostly. They didn't have like studio demos. They had videotapes of their shows. And I felt at the time that the material was so written around the skits that they were doing that I couldn't figure out how it would convey on a record when you couldn't see any of that stuff. So I passed on the project. And as time went on, they started to develop more. They started to reverse it a little more because they got a record deal, realized they had to write songs, right, that would work on the record as well as they would work on stage. And so as the band evolved, they started focusing a little bit more on, traditional songwriting, and that made it easier to make a record.
Right, right. So I guess we're approaching the end of our time here today. I want to thank you again for sitting down with us.
My nose is itching. That's how I know.
Yes, that's the sign. So my last question
that means I'm talking too much.
No, not at all. Not at all. My last question for you is, so after all the success you've had and all the music you've written and the projects you've done, what keeps you excited about what you do?
Well, you never know when things are going to change. It seems now like music is in some sort of a rut. The same kind of rut that it's been in often before. We always have a rut before something exciting happens. So, we were in a terrible rut before the Beatles. We were listening to Frankie Avalon and Fabian. That was what pop music was. And then along came the Beatles and everything changed. Then, of course, the Beatles went away, and then we had the golden age of progressive rock. And then we fell into the doldrums again with disco music, where everything was 4 on the floor. And it was all about, touch my body and let's dance and all this other, empty lyrics. And then what happened? We had punk rock come along, and sort of re-excite everyone about the possibilities. And then the same thing happened in the 80s, when we had, new wave started to get more and more effete and, anemic. And then suddenly we had grunge. we had the Seattle sound and that sort of thing. So everything sort of gets refounded. And when that happens, there's a whole other, level of excitement that happens. So I'm sort of awaiting that because we're definitely in a musical doldrums right now. There's not a lot that's, that's that exciting or that would make somebody who wasn't already committed to be a musician suddenly decide they wanted to be a musician.
Hmm.
And that's the kind of movement, that has to happen.
Right. Right. Well, I appreciate that. And again, thanks for sitting down with us. I want to mention that you have a couple of projects you're working on. Hopefully, you'll be able to get back out on the road and do the Individualist, the True Star shows that have been postponed because of everything that's been happening. But you
Well,
have
we're scheduled for January now. We've
awesome.
been rescheduled. And so instead of in the balmy May, we'll be out in the dead of winter in January and February. But as of right now, we are booked to go.
Awesome. Awesome. And then you also are launching Todd's Honest Truth, right? The Todd's Honest Truth, which is a virtual streaming television interactive show over the internet.
Yeah, that's as a matter of fact, next Monday, the 22nd, will be the first episode. This probably airs after that, so it was the 22nd.
Right.
And if it all goes well, I'll be doing another one on July 3rd and every 2 weeks after that. And it's mostly me hosting me. In other words, I'm doing a lot of video stuff, pre-produced video stuff, because it's very easy for a live online show to lapse into dead air and, sort of nothing happening or disorganization or lack of excitement, because you don't have that direct sort of interaction with the audience. So we're trying to, first of all, not bore the audience,
Right.
give them interesting things to look at, have them be, prepared in a way that looks professional and like you're actually watching TV, and mix it up, do a bunch of different kinds of things. It's not me sitting in front of a bookcase playing a bunch of acoustic versions of my material. There's certainly enough of that on the web already. So while there is music in it, is a music show. It's really a show more about the way that I think and the way I live.
Nice. Nice. Well, we'll look forward to checking that out when, like you said, it'll already have launched the first episode by the time this airs at GearFest, but it's going to be fun to check that out. And man, thanks again for sitting down with us, taking time out of your balmy relaxation there in Hawaii.
It just started raining.
Oh, well, well, it's sunny here, so if you're in Indiana, it'd be a beautiful sunny day.
Oh, great. Okay.
It was good to see you
in
again.
Indiana then.
Right.
All right.
Well, we hope so. I hope please visit us again soon, and thanks again. We appreciate it.
Thank you.